Okay, so Marvel has given us seemingly the origin of Ultimate Wolverine from the new Ultimate Universe, but this is actually two stories in one. There is the origin of Ultimate Wolverine, which is incredibly short. It's more of a prologue for Wolverine number one. Then there is the whole of Ultimate Universe 1 year in, which we're going to start with Wolverine and then jump into that. So the cool thing about Ultimate Wolverine's origin is that Marvel pulls from a bunch of different things within like the regular Marvel universe and brings it over to the Ultimate Universe. And I'll make all that make sense as we go on. But this is all kind of done as really more notes. There's not much in the way of like character to character dialogue here. And so it says from the private dictation logs of Dr. Alanya Prostovich, Director of Science and Technology for the Eurasian Republic, right? And she says the task was handed down to us from the maker himself. The Eurasian Republic was to be centralized home to mutant kind, though its primary motive was control. And who better to control the mutant problem than mutants themselves? Now, you guys are also going to notice here, it is kind of spoken in incomplete English because, of course, as somebody who has seemingly lived her entire life in Russia, English is not her first language. But she says what the maker did not know, however, was what Eurasian Republic chose to do with those mutants. It was not to provide them with sanctuary, nor was it to imprison them. Despite their genetic similarities, they were not viewed as brother and sister, but as tools. Their unique abilities made them, shall we say, useful. Although there was peace between territories as established under the Maker's watchful eye, our leaders grew fearful of incursions, insurrections, and reactionary reprisals. Thus was created Directorate X. We worked in secret, a ghost operation, no paper trail, known to less than a dozen individuals. We were bureaucratic phantoms. To the world at large, I was Director of Science and Technology under Eurasian Republic. To my superiors, I was asset. To my subjects, I was God. Now, here's the cool thing about this, right? Most of you guys are aware of like Weapons Plus and Weapon X in Marvel Comics. We don't have to go into the details as much as I would love to. I love talking about Weapons Plus and Weapon X. But in effect, most of you guys know Weapon X as the project that created Wolverine, right? One of many projects under the umbrella of Weapons Plus. Well, the bigger part of this was that the government couldn't just come out and say, yeah, we have Weapons Plus and we have Weapon X and they're creating super soldiers. Instead, it was very clandestine. It operated under the Department of Agriculture. So for any kind of government oversight committee, it's how much money is the Department of Agriculture spending? Well, they're spending, this much money over here. And we're working with Canada on this project, which is, this and this and that and that. And they could just kind of make it look like a normal governmental agency. And that was it, right? Just a normal government department and nobody ever bothered to ask any questions. In reality, they were creating Wolverine. They were creating Frank Simpson. They were creating the Step for Cuckoos off the DNA of Emma Frost and creating Phantom X. They were creating all these super soldiers, these incredibly powerful beings that existed out there. It's awesome that they're carrying them over into this, right? And just saying, like, sure, it's Eurasia's own version, but at the end of the day, it's all effectively the same thing. Now, we'll also do a little bit of catch up here for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with why things are referred to Eurasia, what the maker's doing here, and all that kind of cool stuff, because Ultimate Universe 1 year in kind of fills all the gaps with all this information. So I'm not going to leave you guys hanging. But continuing on here, right, she says, strength inevitably breeds resistance. Led by coalition of humans and mutants, the opposition rose. They fought Eurasian forces time and again, only to deliver us unexpected victory, one that had evaded us and the maker alike. We called it, as we did others, simply Specimen. Now, here's the interesting thing. So Marvel currently does have the Ultimate X-Men, but the Ultimate X-Men is written and drawn by Peach Momoko. And because of the nature of her writing and art style, the Ultimate X-Men doesn't really feel like it's part of the rest of the Ultimate Universe. It kind of feels like its own separate story. Now, it's not, it ties into everything, but because of that feeling that you get, in a lot of ways, the Ultimate X-Men kind of feel left out to a degree. And as much as I love the work of Peach Momoko, I'm fairly certain Marvel's gonna come along and just kind of take her off the title and move it on to somebody else. I think Peach Momoko is better suited when it comes to writing stories that are kind of out there doing their own thing, like Demon Days and all that kind of stuff. That was amazing. Demon Days was phenomenal. But the bigger part here is this. What Peach Momoko isn't necessarily covering, and what we didn't really know up to this point, was what was going on with the larger mutant landscape. And so by coming along and giving us this information and saying like Colossus and seemingly Omega Red, right, Arkady Rostovich, who's just working with everybody, Magic, Ilyana Rasputin, the younger sister of Colossus, because they lead the entire section of Europe and Asia kind of combined into a single area under their control, that in turn, Wolverine and what effectively seemed to be the rest of the X-Men were kind of vying for freedom, right? Facing off against the Maker's forces and different things like that, the forces of Colossus and so on. Again, they're kind of part of the Illuminati. We'll make sense of all that here in a minute. But the cool thing here is this. What this does is it kind of pulls from like the Days of Future Past type scenario that we saw in the main Marvel Universe. Most of you guys are familiar with the character of Bishop. Well, Bishop came from a timeline that was very similar to Days of Future Past. The difference is that unlike Days of Future Past, where the mind of Kitty Pryde was sent into the past to prevent everything, there wasn't really a whole lot that could be done to stop the control of Sentinels out there. And so what actually ended up happening is what remained of the mutant population and the human population united and overthrew the Sentinel threat. And that's how you ended up with the Xavier security enforcers, the kind of police force for the mutant population themselves, which Bishop and his sister Shard were a part of. But when it comes to something like this, it's very similar, right? Humans and mutants working together to try to overthrow this seemingly omnipotent force. And so what's awesome is that they brought Wolverine in. Now, one doesn't just drag Logan into this situation and force him to do something. Most of you guys know that he would fight kicking and screaming. So they ended up using an Omega level telepath in order to force his will. Now, what it looks like is the Omega level telepath was Charles Xavier, but we don't really get a good enough look at the person to understand. I mean, it's a bald white dude, so how many bald white Omega level telepaths do you know in Marvel Comics? So it's probably Xavier, right? Or potentially Cassandra Nova in this universe. But the bigger point is they ultimately end up brainwashing Wolverine, and then they turn him into the guy that we all know and love. The difference is that instead of him going by the codename Weapon X or Wolverine, he becomes the Winter Soldier in the Ultimate Universe, which is amazing. I absolutely love that. So without further ado, let's kind of get into year one, because for a lot of you guys who are curious about what's happening in this universe and how everything went sideways and all that kind of stuff, this is all basically told to us from the perspective of Nick Fury, which is really cool because we didn't know that Nick Fury existed in this new Ultimate Universe. And so what this does is it kicks off with a family barbecue, right? And he says, this man is a terrorist. Can you tell? And what Nick Fury does is kind of go through all these little lists of things that this guy's known for, right? That he's seemingly a great husband and he's a great father, that he helps everybody out in the neighborhood, changes tires, all kinds of different things. And he says, throw away the sworn affidavits from friends and neighbors attesting to changing tires, shovel driveways, cats saved from trees, the Christmas Eves and soup kitchens, the charitable giving, the summers building houses for the poor. Ignore all of it, because last Tuesday, after one too many drinks, Keith turned to someone he shouldn't have and said, do you ever wonder if these Ultimates people might have a point? And for that, he was killed. Now, the reason for that and the way it was done actually comes from what's called HAND, which in the Ultimate Universe is referred to as Heroic Anomaly Neutralization Directorate. Now, most of you guys who are familiar with Marvel Comics know the HAND in the main Marvel Universe as a mystical ninja organization. They can resurrect each other from the dead, and basically when the HAND comes after you, they'll send like 400 ninjas after you, or they'll send one, right, depending on the level of threat that you represent. But by and large, the HAND is unknown to anybody who's out there outside of the superhero community. Maybe some high-level government officials, but it's incredibly secretive. And so much like this, right, this is kind of a combination of what we would consider to be S.H.I.E.L.D. and the HAND. But it's kind of a perversion of S.H.I.E.L.D. as we know it, because S.H.I.E.L.D. protects the Earth from various threats within in the main Marvel Universe, right? They kind of accompany superheroes on major, campaigns. If it's like Doctor Doom or something like that, if S.H.I.E.L.D. is needed. And they also kind of carry out their own missions as well. Here, HAND works the exact same way, but the threats they neutralize are individuals who basically question the kind of information that's been provided to them. And again, what kind of makes sense of all that Because when Nick Fury turns to his guys, he's like, okay, so like we're sending people in there to find some kind of information on this guy. Because what we do is we take out threats, basically people that, given the nature of the questions they ask or the attitudes they carry, what they post online, that we kind of determine through an algorithm whether or not they're going to be a threat, right? So it's very similar to like Hydra's Project Insight from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so with that being the case, it's like, well, they're not going to find anything, so okay, cool. Let's just fabricate something. But through all of this, one of the things this establishes is that Nick Fury really questions what he's doing, right? Hand agents are now crawling like shadows across every inch of Keith Kincaid's home office looking for terrorist links, a supersuit, a holographic message, a Stark Tech Catalyst container box. They won't find anything. There's nothing to find. But today, we have an audience, so I've got to make it look good. And he says, my name is Nick Fury, director of Hand, and this is my last confession. And he says, of course, the kind of people I work with, I can't actually write it down. I can't take the chance someone might find it early. Even that's no guarantee. Hell, psychic interrogation is page 43 of the Hand training manual. But I wrote that manual. If I fail, I imagine it'll be easy to pluck it out of whatever's left of my head. And if I succeed, well, if you're reading this, whoever you are, you've got me at a rare disadvantage. You know how it all turns out. And what Nick Fury does is he actually activates essentially a countdown timer on his watch. And then at that point, he meets with the Illuminati. Now, this is kind of a clarification for a lot of the things that we've talked about so far. So most of you guys are aware of like Reed Richards in the main Marvel Universe, right? He's a superhero and they explore and Fantastic Four and all that kind of good stuff. The Maker was basically a version of Reed Richards who started out as a good guy in the original Ultimate Universe. Ultimately, there was a story that was, Ultimate Mystery? I think it was by Brian Michael Bendis. It was a trilogy. At the end of that, Reed Richards re-emerges as the Maker, mostly because of the fact that Susan Storm hated the person he'd become. She broke his heart. He also did some really crappy things to her, and ultimately, he just kind of became toxic. But the bigger point is, this is the original Ultimate Universe version of Reed Richards. Now, as most of you guys may also know, the original Ultimate Universe was destroyed in the Incursions, going to Secret Wars 2015. And so what the Maker did is he started traveling around the multiverse trying to find a universe that was very similar to his own. And he ultimately found this one, Earth 6160. So he started going through into the past and making changes so certain things didn't happen. Peter Parker never became Spider-Man, yada, yada, yada. Hence, that's why the Ultimate Spider-Man comic is unfolding the way that it is. But he also brought together the Illuminati, basically a gigantic council of various individuals, and behind the scenes, with a kind of hidden hand, they started slicing up the world and then controlling various sections of it. And so that's why a lot of what you're going to be seeing here is going to be subterfuge, espionage, media control, different things like that. It's what they've been doing this entire time. Now, ultimately, the Maker was seemingly defeated, but was actually locked away in this gigantic dome that he calls the city. But in effect, what this comic does is it's 1 year in after the Maker has been locked up. We've got like 1 or 2 more years before the Maker comes back. And that's kind of the big event that the Ultimate Comics are building up to. And so with all that out of the way, right, Nick Fury says, I bet you have questions. I bet number 1 with a bullet is, why'd he do it? Why did the Maker do what he did? Well, number 1, I just explained it to you. And number 2, they don't even fully know because the Maker didn't give them any of the answers. In order to maintain control, everybody got one little piece of the puzzle, but they never got the whole puzzle, right? So they can't like take all their pieces, bring them together and get the full picture because ultimately it would allow them to turn on the Maker and kind of control everything without his influence whatsoever. But what Nick Fury says is, I've had a bullet in my brain since 1944. Used to say that I survived, but my conscience didn't make it. Up until a year ago, I answered directly to the Maker. In his absence, I answer to the Council. For those of you reading who might not know, and then he just kind of runs over these various individuals. Now, some of them are worth talking about, some of them are not. For example, Captain Britain is Henry Duggery, but he's actually a French guy, and he rules over a huge section of North America and Britain, right? He rules the entire East Coast of the United States, and then he controls England, which in this universe is kind of referred to as the Kingdom of Avalon, but effectively the guy's a prick. Right now, the DaCostas are really interesting. Most of you guys know DaCosta as Sunspot, right? He's a very, very powerful character. his father actually controls him. And instead of Robert DaCosta being a heroic character that we all know and love, he's actually just kind of a subjugate to his dad. And what his dad does is he stays connected via IV to his son and just slowly feeds on his son's powers all the time to keep himself youthful. So it's pretty twisted and toxic. Of course, the Rasputins we already talked about kind of control Eurasia with an iron fist. You've got Sunfire that effectively controls the Asian territories. And then you've got Ra and Khonshu that control all of Africa with the exception of Wakanda. We actually covered that when we went through the first volume of Ultimate Black Panther. We do have an Ultimate Universe playlist. I'll leave it all there. And then of course there's the Ultimate Incredible Hulk, right? You know, the strongest one on Earth and that kind of a thing. But one of the things Nick Fury says is they are the council, they rule the world, at least for now, because he's plotting, right? Plotting to eliminate them, destroy them, and get rid of them. And so as he is kind of explaining things to the council, which ultimately isn't really all that interesting, it'll become kind of interesting here in a little while, he just kind of reflects on the things that he's done. At some point he met with the Maker, and the Maker told him, hey, like, you are an incredibly important person. There are things that I need you to do. And so you kind of get a flashback to really the events of the Ultimates comic itself, when you saw the Ultimates face off against the Incredible Hulk, and seemingly Tony Stark was killed. Of course, we covered that. That'll also be in the Ultimate Universe playlist. But the big question that Nick Fury has is, do you know that Tony Stark is dead? Because if he's not dead, this guy's access to technology and him working alongside Doctor Doom, that it will lead to the ruin of all. So I hear you talking about having absolute authority, and I hear you talking about controlling things, but ultimately Tony Stark may very well have escaped your grasp when it was believed that you destroyed him. And he says, that guy's not the only one. Yes, the Ultimates were originally high profile, but not anymore, right? 1 week ago, another damage control facility was raided and burned to the ground by a flying man on fire. What was lost is still unclear. Now, of course, that is the original Human Torch, Jim Hammond, who's actually an android, but essentially had the powers of Johnny Storm before Johnny Storm was ever introduced in Marvel. And then he also says, and just yesterday, a shipment of weapons meant for the war in Wakanda was destroyed by exploding arrows. Of course, we know that's Hawkeye. And so in effect, instead of the Ultimates operating as a super high profile basically team in the same way that the Avengers would do in the main Marvel Universe, they're taking to guerrilla warfare tactics, right? Pot shots, strike from the shadows, make it impossible for you to be found. By the time anybody knows you've done anything, you're long gone, right? It's that kind of a thing. But ultimately, Nick Fury says there is good news to all of this, right? We are handily winning the information war. The terrorist framing has almost total penetration. It's a classic for a reason. Violent nationalists, pagan false gods, radicals from the future, spoiled Nepo baby millionaires, the narratives write themselves. And he says, we have a decades-long start indoctrinating, and our will-weakening free school milk program has left the population highly susceptible to suggestion. Culture has ramped up its efforts and flooded all media channels with pro-status quo messaging. Film, TV, music, podcasts, video games, comic books. Now, this is what's so fascinating about all of this, right? That for the most part, for the average person living on this earth, in this universe, life is very, very difficult and very dangerous because you never know if you're going to be caught up in the collateral damage of like superhero antics or something along those lines. It's very similar in that way to the original Ultimate Universe, right? A lot of collateral damage, a lot of death and destruction, especially during events like Ultimatum, where Magneto took Thor's hammer and flooded the world when he flipped the poles. And so with this kind of thing, people usually look for someone to blame. And depending on the circumstances, right, it could very well be the people are the problem, but we as people are very, very bad at holding ourselves accountable and blaming ourselves. And so even in that instance, we'll actually double down harder and look for somebody else to blame. But by and large, when times are desperate, when people are desperate, and in the face of any real enemy to point to, well, then people will just believe what they want to believe. And so under normal circumstances, you would simply have people who would just say, well, I mean, you know, is it the Ultimates? I mean, if they weren't doing what they were doing, there wouldn't really be any major, of course it's the Ultimates' fault. And they would just kind of fool themselves and just convince themselves that the problem is the Ultimates. The caveat here is that with the Illuminati, they've helped things along because now you're not simply just talking about people refusing to blame themselves for just kind of allowing the world to become as chaotic as it is and just wanting to shuffle that blame off to somebody else, right? These guys are not Redditors or Twitter users. Instead, they're individuals who have been consistently manipulated and controlled quite literally through not only mass media, but substances within milk, right? Within like their school lunch programs that make them susceptible. So it is a top to bottom society controlling mechanism, and there's no escaping it. There's no way to get away from it. It's completely and totally unavoidable because the people that it's happening to don't know that it's happening, and you can't escape from something that you cannot see. And so it's really, really interesting here because Nick Fury kind of continues this countdown. So a lot of the information that he gives here is really more just kind of like killing time. And so one of the things he tells them is, I mean, like, we got our hands on one of the suits that was left behind in the Incredible Hulk's fight with like Tony Stark and his forces, but this technology is so far ahead of our time. Even our tech guys say it would take like years to break through. And so essentially, Nick Fury has nothing. There's no information, no update or anything. And so basically the entire council starts to leave, but Nick Fury wants to keep him there. He's got about 11 minutes left. And so what he does is he's like, no. There's one final piece of information to give you guys, right? These are our men in Wakanda, Hinokuni, and New York, embedded with what we believe are likely future recruits of the Ultimates. We have dozens just like them all over the world, equipped with airtight artificial identities and pseudo-psychologies. Can the Ultimates be anybody because we don't know their identities? Yeah, but so can we. And that's where the Illuminati freaks out because they're like, wait, you have put sleeper agents in our own territories. But if anything, it's actually a testament to how capable Nick Fury and Hand are. If they're able to instill effectively their own guys right under the noses of this Illuminati, then either the Illuminati is incredibly inept or the Hand is just that good. And I would argue the Hand is that good, right? To be able to have agents there and no one knows about it, not even the Illuminati, then there's no way the Ultimates would be aware of it, right? There's no way that they would figure it out. And so what these guys do, these agents, is they essentially send information into Hand, right? It's very reminiscent of like the old McCarthyism, the whole Cold War Red Scare type thing. If you see something, say something. Is your neighbor a communist? Then make sure you say something, right? Like using the citizenry as a weapon against itself, all the while allowing those individuals who snitch like that chick at McDonald's to convince themselves and trick themselves into believing that they actually did the right thing. And so ultimately, Nick Fury kind of gives us this little bit of an explanation here in saying that he was, in a lot of ways, the man on the wall. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what that means, in the main Marvel universe, Nick Fury for decades was just like the dude who was there and did some stuff. And it wasn't until the story Original Sin, which was phenomenal, that it actually established that what Nick Fury had been doing over the course of his entire career is that while we, as the comic book reader, would see Nick Fury all the time, those were life model decoys. They were robots. What the real Nick Fury was doing is he was operating as the man on the wall, that he was taking out all these major threats that existed in the world that could have destroyed humanity. So for all the threats that the Avengers faced off against and all the threats that the X-Men faced off against, Nick Fury's statement was, you have no idea how many I actually stopped before they even got to you. That's what he'd been doing for years and years and years. And that's what he's been doing here. The difference is that instead of being the man on the wall and protecting the Earth from credible threats, at the direction of basically the Maker, he was taking out various threats that actually could have been helpful, basically threats that would have gotten in the way of the Maker's plan. So Nick Fury was the one who killed Mantis, for example. Nick Fury killed Dum Dum Dugan. Nick Fury, of course, killed the Inhumans, but in reality, he was doing us all a favor by doing that. But like all these different threats over the years, Nick Fury went after and took all of them out. So he's really been the lone instrument and the weapon behind the Maker's rise to fame. Because it was kind of a big question that we had here, right? For all the capabilities of the Maker, surely he didn't go through and stop every single character from ever coming into existence. There had to be some that slipped through the cracks somewhere along the line, or if they existed out in other parts of the universe, they kind of came into their own on their own, right? So how did the Maker account for those? And this is how. It's a genius idea from Deniz Camp. I love the way that it's done here, right? I love the way that Camp does this. It's a phenomenal idea. And so as the clock strikes down, Nick Fury says, whatever I did, I believed I was doing for the greater good. I gave my life to the greater good, which would make me a dead man, wouldn't it? And so at that point, in front of the entire council, he executes a self-destruct program, right? It just starts counting down from 15 seconds. And he's like, everybody here is gonna die. I have done some horrible things over the course of my life. I have done terrible things. I have wiped out entire groups. I have allowed genocides to happen. I've been active in those campaigns. Because of me, the loss of life is astronomical, but I am not looking to die without redemption. And so even if humanity may very well be too far gone, even if there is no saving them, destroying you would give me some measure of redemption, because without you in this world, humanity can figure out how to make it on its own. And so finally, the countdown reaches 0 and nothing happens. The entire council starts laughing, right? And they're like, his face, right? The look on his face, it gets me every single time. And they're like, I suppose it's that time again. They barely last a year now. This has been a gigantic ruse, right? This is how far along the curve the Illuminati is, right? This is how smart they are. That Nick Fury may very well have done a lot of these things at the direction of the Maker. But the reality here is they're all false memories, because this Nick Fury is either a clone or a life model decoy. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a second, because the self-destruct initiates and Nick Fury dies, right? He literally just kind of melts, and that's it. And so what ends up happening is the Illuminati are kind of like, I'll never understand why the Maker continues to allow this, right? We demand obedience absolute from all. And that's where DaCosta says, well, for one, a spy isn't a soldier or a citizen. A spy who will not betray you is not much of a spy. In order for a spy to be effective, they need to have a conscience. Otherwise, they're just a person following orders that will do whatever you tell them to. And he says, additionally, these expected betrayals have the potential to flush out unexpected ones. Traitors tend to find one another. But to tell you the truth, most of all, I think the whole thing just makes him smile, because they walk into this room and there are dozens of these Nick Furies just waiting to be woken up, to being given the same mission, being given the same memories, and being sent on the same path that will ultimately lead to this exact same thing. It is yet just another system of control. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. It's a crazy ending to the story. I loved it. Thank you all for watching. Make sure you check out this Ultimate Universe playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.